Hi, welcome to another Unity 5 tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make an animated loading screen for your mobile game. So if you've been looking at my new opening screen, you'll notice that I like shatter effects. So I did a bit of investigation of how you actually would do this in real time in Unity, and I've come up with this. So I'll show you today how we're going to have a logo enter the screen and then shatter like this. So I'm working with Android. This is going to work with any platform, but I just wanted the shape of the screen. So let's start with a new scene, and I'll make it from scratch for you. So to begin with, in our new scene, we've got a camera. There's a light in here. Probably don't actually need that light because I'm working with an unlit texture. The camera, I want to look straight down the y-axis rather than looking along the z-axis, and that's because the way that the shatter code works and the physics that it actually has on it. So let's turn that camera and rotate it so it's looking straight down, and that's probably a rotation around the X by 90. We should be looking down. Let's just have a look. Yep. Okay, so there's our y-axis there, and the camera is actually looking down there. Now the camera itself, we don't want to use a skybox. We use a solid color and make it black, like that. And now we need to bring in our plane that's going to have our logo on it. Okay, so in the hierarchy, right-click, 3D object, and plane. Now the reason I'm using a plane and not a quad or a sprite or something is because I need something that has a whole bunch of polygons in it. Now this plane itself, if we just zoom in on it, you can see it's made up of all these little tiny triangles, which is what we're going to pull apart in a moment. So let's just get that kind of centered where we want it. And you could also resize it at this point if you want it to be a bit bigger and fill up the screen like that. So the image I've got is one I got from Icon Archive, which is just a brown monster. There it is. Now that's upside down, so let me just flip that around. 180 around the Y. Okay, so this is the image that we're going to work with. It's a PNG, so it's got nice transparency around the outside there. Now, the first thing we'll do is actually put the shatter code onto this plane. Now, I've already written it. It's called Explode Mesh here. I'm going to drag and drop that onto the plane. And if you press play at this point, nothing will happen because that code is set to only run when we call it to run. So it's a function called divide mesh, and I'll go through this in a moment, but for now I'm just going to change this to the start function so that we can see what it does. So let's just save that, switch back to Unity, press play, and there you go. So what it's doing is it's creating a replica of your plane by grabbing all of the little triangles and all of the vertices of the triangles and creating a whole bunch of little singular meshes. When I press play, you can actually see all those triangles appear over here. And each triangle has a collider added to it and also a rigid body, which makes it move. Now, for each rigid body, the gravity is turned off. So it's only going to explode outwards and move along the XZ plane, not in the Y direction. I guess it depends on the actual effect that you want and how you want it to move. So let's have a look at that explode mesh. I'll go back in here. I'm going to just put back in the function that I had. So it's public void explode mesh. So it's a public because we're going to call it from outside of this code. Now, what it does, without going into too much detail, is that it grabs the mesh renderer, mesh filter, and the actual mesh that is on that game object. So that's the actual plane and all of its triangles. It then gets hold of the mesh vertices and the normals for each, and also the UVs. The UVs are important because each new triangle that gets created, we want it to have the same UVs that same triangle in the entire mesh has, so it only gets part of the image mapped onto it. We then count through all of those sub meshes and basically create down here a whole bunch of little game objects from that. And from there, we then add on a mesh render for the triangles, the mesh filter, a box collider, and then we also add a rigid body to which we add an explosive force. And this force is going to only move in the X and Z directions at the position of the actual game object. So there'll be no force added in the Y. And I've also added a little bit of a torque, which will make the triangles rotate a bit. And there's a randomness in here as well. Now, if you want it to be more forceful, then you would change these values. And if you want it to have more spin on each one, you would change these values here. And I've turned gravity off as well. You could just comment this line out if you want to see what the effect is on your particles that you've created. And then we destroy the game object. This destroys the original plane. If you don't do this, the original plane will still be in the scene while everything else is moving around. So just slowly, I'll now slide through this so that you can type it all out. And then that gets attached to the plane. Now, if you want to test it, just make this void start as your function. And then you can play it and it will explode straight away. But as I said, we're going to call this from elsewhere. So that's the explosion part. Next, we're going to use the mecanim system to animate the entry of our logo. So I'll just zoom out here a bit. And to do that, I've had the animation window and added it down to the bottom here so that we can see the scene, the game, and also the animation. Now, the mecanim system is quite powerful, and I'm just going to show you how to set some keyframes and positions. First of all, select the object that we're going to animate. That's the plane. Then in the animation window, you'll see that a create button comes up. Click on create to create an animation. In here, you want to type your animation name. So let's say logo drop. And then you'll see logo drop come up here at the top of the animation window. If you go back to project, you'll see that logo drop now becomes an animation. Let me just put this back to 2 columns. Right, so there it is there. There's the one I made before. Now, when you create this for your object, it will also create an animator and add it to it. So if you're familiar with mecanim and the way it works, it needs to have an animator which then controls the running of your animation that you've created or allow it to run. Back in the animator, we'll now add some properties to our logo. So we wanted to enter in from the top of the screen. Now, if you have a look across the top of the animator, you'll see the number of seconds at which your animation is going to run. And you can zoom out on that if you want it to be longer, but I'll just make it a 1 second entry. So right at the 0 position, we're going to add a property, and that property will be a transform and position, because we're changing the, Z position of this object, because remember we're in a different axis system here. So the Z, which is the up one, we're going to have it come down the screen. So at this point here, make sure that you've got record selected, which is on by default, so that any movement you make in your scene will get recorded into your animation. On that first keyframe that we've just created there, we will, in the scene, hit the W key to get hold of the axes and move the logo up until it's outside the top of the game view itself. So that's the top position. Now, if we slide this along, you'll see that the logo is animating between the 2 keyframes. When we first added in this property of position, it created automatically our two keyframes for us, and it set them to the current position of the logo, which was in the middle of the screen. So now we have this kind of animation going on. So over the first second of our game or of our scene, it's going to drop the logo in. Okay, so let's press play and have a look how that's going to work. What you'll immediately find is it's looping. So it's working, but it's looping. And that happens by default. So we need to turn that looping off on that animation. Go back to the project and find that logo drop that you created. Select it in the hierarchy, in the inspector, there'll be a loop time. You want to untick that, and that will stop things from looping. So let's press play now, and you'll see that your logo now enters the screen. If you wanted that to be longer, go back to the animator and just grab hold of this last keyframe here. I'll just zoom out, and just the one right at the top will move all keyframes that are underneath. Move that over to 2 seconds, and then if we play it, it will be a little bit slower. So I guess it's what you want it to look like. Now, we're going to have our logo shatter once it's sort of come to a stop in the middle of the screen. To do that, we can add an event in the animator which links up our keyframes of our animation with the code. So remember, we added the code onto the plane, which was in the explode mesh, and that explode mesh function was a public void. That allows our script to actually grab hold of it. Now we can right click on the timeline in the animator and go add animation event, and then in our drop down list we will see all of the public functions that we've made available in the script that's attached to the same game object that this animation is on. So we can select divide mesh, and that will make divide mesh happen at this 2 second mark. Right, so let's play it and see what happens. Now what you would have seen just there when it fell down is that it shrunk immediately. Now the reason that it shrunk is that we scaled this logo up, and if you have a look at the scale in the inspector, it's at 1.4. Now I could have zoomed the camera in to get it bigger on the screen, and that would have then not caused a problem. The reason why it's doing that is because the vertices that are getting created from the plane in order to create the explosion are just getting the base values of the vertices in the plane, not multiplied by the actual scale. Now you could fix that by getting rid of the scale on the plane here, put this back to 1, and then zoom the camera further in to what you're after. Or you could update the code, and I can show you where you do that back in the project. Open up explode mesh just here. So inside the code where you're grabbing the vertices and assigning them into each new little triangle, then you need to multiply them by the scale. Now, in this case, the scale for all three X, Y, and Z's is the same. So I've just grabbed the X and multiplied it here for all of the vertices. But if you want to have a different scale for each different dimension, then you're going to have to do this individually. So it's up to you, depends on what you're actually trying to achieve. So putting this in here will mean that I don't have to scale my logo back to 1 and move my camera. Okay, so just save that and go back and just play it again. And now we'll come down, the triangles will divide nice and neatly at that point. And that's basically it. So if you want to learn more about the mecanim system in Unity and the ins and outs of all of the animation things that you can do, check out my online course and you'll find a link for that in the description of this video.